Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IYAP discussion, I Inspire. I'd like to begin with a very quick apology for those of you who tuned in at 4 o'clock. We were having a few technical glitches, but thankfully, all of that has been resolved, so we can start the conversation. Um, Before I begin, I just want to, I say that I hope that all of you are doing okay. I hope that your friends, family, loved ones, everyone is adhering to the curfew regulations and that you're all safely indoors. Um, I hope that all of you have stocked up with food, essential items, and medication. And if you haven't, then I hope things get a bit easier because these are certainly very trying times. I'd also like to mention very briefly that if possible, wherever possible, please try and help people in your community who may not be as fortunate as you are, because that's the sort of response that we need predominantly from each other moving forward. Um, so the International Youth Association Assembly for Peace. So what they've been doing these days is they've actually been conducting discussions just like this with individuals from different backgrounds, different professions, and they've all got together to, discuss life during the coronavirus, life during COVID-19. And I would highly recommend that you visit their Facebook page or even their YouTube account because there are several discussions just like this covering many subject areas. And if you're bored at home and you'd like to learn something new or taking a new perspective on things, those videos are definitely someplace. They're definitely a place for you to start. So I'd highly recommend that you take a look at them as well. Just to give a bit of background as to from where I'm standing, or sitting rather at the moment. I am currently a graduate student at studying in the United Kingdom. And unfortunately, like many of us, are still stranded here. We haven't been able to return back home because of the coronavirus, because airports have shut down. So many of us are still in accommodation, in college accommodation, and we're managing our studies through online classes for the moment. So, being a student here and being stuck in the UK during a time period like this, um, I've definitely been observing the different ways in countries respond to the virus, in the way that they mobilize their resources, in the way that they share information. For example, as you know, in Sri Lanka at the moment, everything is strictly under curfew. In the UK, we're currently having a lockdown, which means you're only allowed to leave your house for essential purposes, and that may be for grocery shopping, to see a GP where possible, and to buy medication. Every other shop is closed. But you still see people on the roads. We're allowed one period a day, so like 1 hour a day, where you can leave your house for exercise, things like that. So we don't have a strict curfew, but we definitely have a lockdown. Um, but then strict curfews and complete lockdowns have been carried out all over the world, and we can see how different countries are managing their populations based on that. And of course, the main takeaway from this is we're still trying to figure out how to manage the virus. We're still trying to understand how can we safeguard people better, how can we prevent our health services from getting overwhelmed, how can we make sure that this virus is contained, so to speak. So the success or the failure of these methods we are yet to see. And unfortunately, this also means that it's often at the risk of millions, let's hope not, several thousands of lives. I'm sure most of us have been checking online for, the number of cases, the number of deaths so far, and those numbers definitely don't look too good. However, what we need to focus on is every country collectively, in one way or the other, is trying to flatten the curve. Um, so, with that background based, what I would like to talk about right now concerning COVID-19 is I would like to talk about how history can inform our responses towards the way we manage the virus or the way we safeguard people. And I know that there are lots of people who question whether or not we can compare the current pandemic with experiences of the past. And I understand where that's coming from because we live in a very different world from where we came from. To compare this to the Spanish flu, to compare this to the plague, or the Black Death, or all those previous pandemic situations, is it's a bit difficult. And I say this because right now we are greatly interconnected. Technology is definitely a lot more advanced than it used to be. We've taken great leaps in terms of developing medicines, and our response and capacity now is a lot greater than what it used to be. However, I also think that we shouldn't disregard history altogether when it comes to situations like this because there are still there are still lessons that can be learned, and there are still ways that we can use historical responses to give sense to what we're experiencing right now and help us better understand the situation. And in most cases, we don't even have to look too far into the past. We can look into our most recent past. For example, there's a reason why countries like Korea, Singapore, and China are showing signs of um, responding to this better. It's because they were countries that bear the brunt of the SARS outbreak or the MERS outbreak. So much so that Korea has a rising competitive market which develops vaccines, which does research into flus and pandemics. And because of that, if I remember correctly, by mid January 2020, they were able to devise the COVID-19 testing kit, which most countries are using as of right now. So the reason that their response was so quick, the reason that they were able to establish certain policies and regulations of governance is because they looked back to their most recent medical history, the most recent pandemics that they had to struggle with, and they took those lessons and they implemented it as soon as possible. Because if you look into this, what they say is the moment you realize a virus transfers between people and not just from animals to people, that is when you have to start responding. That is when you have to start taking immediate action. So, what's happening right now is lots of countries were unable to cope up with that. Lots of countries were struggling to understand, do we respond? Do we just wait and see what happens? What do we do? Um, so that is why it is important that we look back to how we used to tackle these issues in the past. Now, the nature of this virus is very, very uncertain. A little like the avian flu, what potentially happens is the virus affects your lungs, and then your white blood cells start reacting, and they start um, filling in your lungs with fluid in an attempt to fight the virus. And this is why it's been terrible for respiratory people who have respiratory issues. Um, this was also a similar sign in the Spanish flu. And what people used to say was because it allegedly originated from soldiers, this was because they were in terrible trench conditions, and that's why it was a respiratory problem, so on and so forth. Um, Indeed, it's still very uncertain as to how this virus is transmitting COVID-19, and we're learning quite a bit about it as each day goes on. I think only just recently it was discovered that a patient in Iceland who was asymptomatic had 2 to 3 strands of the virus in his system, but showed no signs of it. And again, we had the case where COVID-19 had been transferred from a zookeeper to a tiger. Um, Definitely very strange, unusual, dystopic, uh, um, you know, uh, things that are happening right now. It's a very, very uncertain time. But what we do know is that, and history has also shown this, um, the process of quarantining people or containing them, social distancing, has been very, very successful in terms of limiting the number of deaths, in terms of limiting how fast the virus spreads. Um, so, quarantine, which most of us are going through right now, or self isolation, however you want to term it, is a non pharmaceutical form of intervention. And what we're essentially doing right now, and what governments that are promoting this want to do right now, is buy time. And by buying time, we are preventing health services from getting overwhelmed. We're preventing more people from being exposed, and we're trying to um, give the virus some time before becoming a widespread entity. And when talking about the Spanish flu, there were several studies done between um, Philadelphia and St. Louis, and this is the most famously quoted study. And what they mention in these two studies is, Philadelphia shut down immediately. They shut down all schools. They practiced social distancing. They insisted that people stay in quarantine, whereas St. Louis took a bit more time. They were delayed and they shut down schools fairly later. And what was noticed was the death rate, the number of deaths between either location, there was a vast difference. Philadelphia managed to, safeguard quite a few more people than St. Louis did, unfortunately. And that is why, social distancing has proven to be very important. Staying indoors and preventing the spread of the virus has proven to be very important. Um, Interestingly enough, the notion of staying indoors, quarantine, and I'm sure many of you already know this, but it originates from a Spanish term for 40 days. So what it means is 40 days of isolating yourself. And this is a practice that used to come out of ships and sailors actually. So when they were sailing from port to port, if a receiving port would hear about an incoming vessel that had, 6 sailors on board, or if there was news of a potential flu among the crew members, they were asked to go into quarantine, which means they had to dock outside and not enter that specific location within only after a specific number of days, only after they knew that they were perfectly fine and that nothing was wrong. So that is essentially a very mellow, watered down version of that is what most of us are experiencing right now and are practicing right now. So this is nothing new. It is new for people in our generation because staying indoors, staying cramped up, unable to travel, unable to do things is something that is very unnatural for us, especially because transport, communication, access to resources is so much more easier today than it once used to be. And ironically, this is exactly why the virus has spread as fast as it has within the past few months, unknowingly to people. So it is quite an interesting paradox, and in some ways also ironical because we have all this technology, we have the comfort of traveling from one corner of the world to the other, and that is exactly what could be detrimental to us. And it's very difficult for us to hold back from going back to doing what we're used to because we're so accustomed to it. Um, it's also interesting to note that in the past, because pandemics and flus and viruses were fairly rampant, the governments had legislative powers, specifically in the early 20th century, which concerned the management of individuals during a pandemic situation. And this is something that is being heavily criticized and discussed today because it seems in most cases that governments are not ready for a pandemic situation and they don't know what to do. They don't know how to address closing businesses. They don't know how to address parts of the population that are going to bear the brunt of having to stay at home and not go to work. They are struggling to come to terms with resource allocation and access to food and other necessities. So this is really a time for us, as well as governments and just society at large, to start questioning, you know, how are we to move forward from this? What policies have not been implemented thus far, and what should have been implemented? If businesses had some kind of protective structure that protects their workers, that protects the business during times like this, would our responses be different? If there was adequate allocation or at least access to resources, would we be less stressful while we're stuck here at home? Are questions that we have to start asking, because these were legislative procedures that existed in the early 20th century because pandemics and viruses were so rampant, and then suddenly it died down, and it's come up again. So we need to start thinking of new policy, of new planning, as we go on. um, because if you look into emergency planning, and if you look into crisis situations, the only thing that's just as high risk as a pandemic situation is either a civil war or a terrorist attack. So it's extremely high level, it's extremely risky, but unlike other entities, it's invisible. We're still learning about it as we go, and it'll take 6 months to a year before a viable solution comes to us. And until then, our lives have drastically changed the way that they have. Um, Another thing that we're seeing during this time, and this is also based on lessons learned from the past, is some countries seem to be doing a lot better. China was recently talking about, opening up again and just letting people move around within precautionary standards, of course, as they once used to. And we've started to question why. Why are these countries recovering? Why does it seem like things are slowly coming back to normal? And it's because they have developed better health systems. They have contact tracing implemented, um, and they're using experiences that they had to go through before to tackle this a lot better, to manage it faster, um, and hopefully by the end of this year, to a certain extent, reduce the extreme risk of the virus. So I think it's important that as young people, that we look back into history and we question how we can implement certain things better at present, because the conversation around a potential pandemic being the next biggest threat that this generation sees is not a new conversation. This conversation has been going on for a long time. Scientists have spoken about it. I know that within the first few weeks of the pandemic occurring, um, the Bill Gates TED Talk was widely shared and rewatched, and that happened, I think, 4 to 5 years ago, where he talked about pandemics being the next biggest threat for the world. Um, and people started bringing that back again. People started talking about it again, and in a sense, we were too late. But it's also important to realize that this wasn't a new conversation. This isn't something that should essentially shock us, because research has been done about this. It's just a matter of it reaching the right policymakers. It's a matter of it reaching the right level of priority within a country and its people. So, you know, if those conversations had happened, the way that we're responding to the crisis situation right now would definitely be a lot different. So it's something for you, for all of us to think about. And it is important that we keep people accountable for this as well, because, of course, in time, the virus will run its course, it'll find a new vessel to carry on in. We don't know if this will be a seasonal thing where it comes back every few years or within a certain month. We don't know if people are going to be carriers of this virus for however many years, if there will be after effects of that, which is why it's important that now um, we think about how we can combat it in the future, and we take the lessons that we've learned even in this short period of time. Because I'm sure you and I, of course, our circumstances are a lot different. The situation in Sri Lanka is a lot different than it is over here in the UK. Um, the UK has been churning out quite a few negative numbers in terms of the number of deaths. And so far Sri Lanka hasn't reached the higher levels yet, and let's hope and pray that it stays that way. But we have been seeing issues that are cropping up throughout the period that we've been under lockdown or under curfew. And instead of taking those problems forward, or um, or like helping those problems reach a point of aggravation, I think it's vital that we stay responsible in our responses towards this. if you're asked to stay at home, and if you're asked to, you know, wash your vegetables an extra amount of times before you cook them, if you get them delivered, if you're asked to wash your hands for 20 seconds, if you're asked to wear a mask, please do so, because it only makes this easier for the people who are battling to find a vaccine. It makes it easier for healthcare workers who are committing their entire lives right now to make sure that people in hospital um, are safe, and that they get better. So in a sense, we're all helping each other. And I know that there are lots of conversations that are revolving around COVID-19 right now, from how it affects your healthcare to how it affects your work from home progress to how it impacts family structures or just even your own personal mental health. But I think a conversation that we need to have is, let's pay attention to what has transpired in the past, and let's prevent that from carrying on into the future. And if it does, let's use the tools we have now to be better prepared for it in time to come. So I hope that gave you some food for thought. Um, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay safe, look after each other, and let's hope that the next time, this time next year, let's hope that we hear some good news and that things are in a much better standing. I'd like to sincerely thank IYAP for inviting me to come on board and have this conversation with you. They're doing some fantastic work. They're making sure a lot of voices across the board are being heard. So do get in touch with them. Do keep, uh, you know, do take a look at what they've been doing in terms of making sure we address different perspectives of this issue. And above all, wash your hands and stay indoors and have a wonderful day. Thank you.